Good afternoon and welcome to this month's show. I'm Luke McCormack. During today's show, we will discuss mobility strategies in the federal government. With me on today's show are Frank Konieczny, Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Air Force; Dave Driegert, Assistant Program Manager, Mobility Sea Warrior Program, U.S. Navy; Marc Jaffan, Vice President of Strategy, Lookout; Dave Wright, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Network Standards, Ruckus Networks; and Randy Clark, Client Partner, DoD Verizon Enterprise Solutions. Well, mobility certainly is exploding these days. Everything from, enabling the warfighter to, enabling us in our sort of consumer, daily doing, so to speak, and it's interesting to see how this particular technology, from a consumer perspective, is transforming itself over to a mission perspective very quickly. And so interested to hear about that. Frank, how are we doing in the U.S. Air Force in regards to mobility? You've got I'm sure, incredible amount of use cases out there. Can you tell us about the progress with mobility in the U.S. Air Force?
Oh, hi, Luke. Yes, the first thing we decided to do when we set up our Mobility Council was develop a line of effort to figure out what connectivity we actually needed across all the bases. Right now we're working on an LTE initiative to bring LTE to all the bases very quickly within like 2-3 years. And we're trying to do that in a partnership with the industry as well. So that's one of the things we're trying to do, because we can't really do operations at the flight line unless we have the right connectivity. And that's one of the things we're trying to do right now, is to move logistics operations, mobility maintenance operations out there right now. And we have an app to do that right now, and we're trying to progress with that. But that's one of the initiatives. The other initiative we have is, we already established, was GuestNet. GuestNet's basically an interface to the internet from every base, basically used for electronic flight books. That was the initial use case. However, there's other use cases that have come up now according to that. So as we move down the path, we're looking for enhanced connectivity everywhere on the base now, not only in the living quarters, but also at the flight lines.
I would imagine that you would have enhanced connectivity while in transit in the air as well, too, right? It would. Yes. I think it's a big part of what's happening with the.
One of that is the the enhanced network, which is the mesh network that we've always talked about as having between all the airplanes, as well as the ground, as well as the satellites. We're working on that as well. That's a little more complex because of the way you have to do beam steering and everything else associated with attaching to each of the aircraft.
Sure,
but yes, we're working on that.
Securing that environment is tricky as well. We'll talk about that some more. Dave, how about over at the Navy? How are we doing in regards to mobility, in regards to the fleet?
Yeah, so the mobility in the Navy, I think, is certainly a growing effort. With regards to the Sea Warrior program, we've developed 24 mobile applications that are actually in production today. So any sailor can go to both the Apple and Google App Store, download those apps right to their personal device. They're also available for government devices as well. They're really centered around.
Can you do that on a ship?
If you download the application prior to going afloat, so you can have that information and functionality once you go afloat. And those applications have been downloaded nearly around 400,000 times at this point. A lot of those applications also provide sailors a lot of personal information about training and education throughout their careers in the Navy. And ultimately, we've kind of pushed forward to try to centralize the development of applications, development of mobile services within the Navy. And so we've developed a site called the Navy App Locker. And it really culminates all of the application development around the Navy into one central site. So sailors can go there and they can understand what are the trusted government-developed applications that they can download to their devices, and know that the information within those applications is official and trusted. That app locker can be found on Navy.mil. It's easily accessible by anybody, and those applications are all free to download. And we've also developed a content management delivery system to where applications are really restricted on the amount of content we can deliver to them based off of downloading that application to a sailor's device. We don't want to burden the sailor's device by an application that ultimately consumes their device. So we now have a cloud-hosted delivery system where we can actually deliver a lot of content to them, but not burden their personal device. And so we're cognizant of the fact that we want sailors to use their personal devices, but we certainly don't want to make it a burden on them.
Right, it'd be sort of a light touch. And I thought I read an article where it was the Navy, I know the Air Force, actually has airmen and sailors that are actually writing a lot of these mobile apps, which is just fascinating. Maybe we can talk about that later. Dave, how about at Ruckus? Tell us about the progress over there in regards to enabling the mission in regards to your technology from a mobile perspective.
Sure, thanks, Luke. Just backing up to what Frank was talking about, we've been involved with a lot of smart base initiatives. So, we've been deploying our indoor and outdoor Wi-Fi access points, in family housing, BAQs, BOQs, the base hospitals, MWR facilities, and other on-base public facilities, really to provide that sort of ubiquitous, pervasive Wi-Fi footprint.
Do they even wire a base anymore in regards to housing, or is it all Wi-Fi, I wonder?
A lot of the developers that we work with are just put in wireless. I mean, that is
5G technology that's out there now, right?
So many of the residential devices don't even have an Ethernet port anymore. So the only way you're going to get to it is with a wireless connection, really a Wi-Fi connection. So doing a lot of that, that's an area we see a lot of growth in. To the point about rolling out LTE solutions, Ruckus has a lot of initiatives around the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, 3.5 gigahertz band. It's a new opportunity I hope to talk a little bit more about later in the program, but that's another area that we think really has a lot of applicability for the federal government and its agencies. Secure Wi-Fi is a big area of progress. Everybody is looking for how do you provision clients with secure credentials, how do you manage that, how do you do it over the life cycle of the client and their certificate. So we have a solution called CloudPath that is of great interest to a number of agencies. We've been trialing that with some federal law enforcement, and it's also really good for like surge applications. So you've got a bunch of people coming into a base on TAD, or you've got an incident response center, and you got to bring a lot of agents in. We can enroll those people even before they're on scene with this CloudPath system, so that when they get there, they're connecting securely and seamlessly.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Wi-Fi capability is just amazing how much enablement that gives the war fighter, or name your mission, but it certainly does open up the attack surface. So Marc, what are we doing from a lookout perspective on sort of making sure that attack surface gets locked down and that we don't have exposure? I know you guys are right in the middle of that.
That is where we find ourselves quite frequently, yes. Sure. It's great to hear about all these initiatives where the proliferation of mobile devices is really upon us now, and so we tend to look at this as an opportunity where as you look at mobile devices and the utilization of mobile devices, you can look at that in a way that allows you to be productive, be connected, but do so securely. And our approach is really to look at four risk angles that tend to present themselves on mobile devices. So we analyze and look at the applications that are on mobile devices. We also look at the devices themselves and the behavioral patterns in the operating systems of the devices, whether there are any kind of threats associated with those. We tend to look at the connectivity aspect as well, complementary to things that Ruckus does. We look at it from a device side to ensure that there is security in the connectivity of a mobile device. And we also look at the connectivity from a web or content standpoint. In other words, ensuring that URLs that are being accessed from a mobile device are secure URLs. This is an emerging vector, an emerging threat vector that we're finding. It's associated with mobile phishing, where folks are sort of lured into thinking it's a secure website, but yet it tends to redirect them into a different way.
Mm-hmm. And they're getting much more sophisticated now, and it's by the time you realize that you're in sort of one of these honeypots, you've been had, so to speak. So great, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about what you guys are doing with some of your AI analysis and et cetera. Verizon, Randy, how are we doing in regards to progress there? Mobile technology is a big part of what Verizon is doing today, enabling the entire spectrum of agencies across the federal government.
Well,
Give us an update.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, from my perspective, I've seen a great deal of progress within the federal government in mobility initiatives. I think the paradigm shift is starting to happen. When we look at our IT infrastructure, we have to be mobile first because the workforce of the future is mobile. So I think it's going to change the way we architect IT systems, leading with mobile instead of mobile being an afterthought. Verizon takes that to heart. We believe that we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution that's going to be enabled by 5G. and the low latency that 5G brings, the amount of bandwidth that 5G brings. And mobility and IoT are the norm today in our society, and they're becoming a norm within federal agencies. Frank talked about the electronic flight bag, maintenance and logistics applications, the flight line becoming enabled by LTE, and then in the future 5G. But the value is really having the ability to create action on data on a timely manner, and that's about speed and it's about security. AI is the enabler here. So when you think of the progress that's being made, Verizon has invested an awful lot of money in its fiber infrastructure. You have Fios, you have our acquisition of EXO, you have the Corning deal. We're laying down fiber at breakneck speed because there is no wireless without wireline, and fiber is part of the solution there. We're also investing a great deal of time, money, and effort into 5G, and we can talk about CBRS and the value of leveraging unlicensed spectrum through LAA with licensed spectrum to create the size of the pipe. But the progress really is marrying the cloud with edge networking. In the government, we refer to it as distributed networking. So putting the intelligence at the edge of the network. They do that an awful lot in industrial IoT. So sensors are actually analyzing the data real time at the edge without the necessary backhaul requirement. That's also important to the government because they need isolation for their degradation of comms initiatives. But high capacity spectrum is the key to edge networking. And we've already kind of touched on CBRS, but then how do you secure that? And I think one of the most interesting areas today is you look at connected devices. They're going to be connected through a series of different wireless protocols. It could be Bluetooth, it could be near field, it could be Wi-Fi, it could be commercial LTE, it could be private LTE, it could be 5G. And what you're trying to do is enable an IP address in a person with an application real time. And you have to do that globally. And we're doing an awful lot of work in that area, and we'll talk a little bit more about software-defined perimeter and what that enables from a cybersecurity architecture moving forward. I do want to point out, though, Verizon has done a lot of firsts this year. This has been an exciting year for us. We got a gigabyte over LTE. We did our carrier integration work. We did MIMO and QAM. We launched our Cat M1 network nationally.
And interested to hear about we tried to find out if we could get the 5G rollout schedule on the last show with one of your colleagues. So we'll ask you again on another round. Dave, let's talk about a specific program at Ruckus and maybe something that you're doing in regards to enabling one of these agencies in respect to your technology and where you guys are with that.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. In terms of like a specific program that I would focus on as a success story, I'm going to bring it right back to CBRS because if you look at that framework, it's really novel from a federal perspective in that some of the incumbents in the band that's being opened up for new commercial services are federal users, right? They're DoD. They're DoD users there. There's some radar systems. So they're the incumbents, but they're also potentially some of the new users of these commercial services that are being introduced to the band. And we think that's just very compelling. It enables some of the both public and private LTE deployments that Randy was just talking about. And in a nutshell, it really allows LTE to be deployed by an agency or by a branch, much the same way that Wi-Fi is deployed today. So there's this GAA or this opportunistic tier within the CBRS framework where you don't have to have a license to operate. You can, access 20, 40 megahertz or more potentially of spectrum. And spectrum access is always the key, as Randy was just talking about. So the ability for a service to stand this up for base connectivity, like Frank was talking about, have LTE coverage at your airstrip, use it for in-building coverage. A lot of buildings do not have good cellular coverage from the outdoor macro networks. So, Ed Chan from Verizon is talking about the opportunities they see with CBRS to provide better in-building solutions. So we think that's a huge opportunity. From an agency perspective, it also gives the agency the control over the data flow. It goes through an EPC or a core that they are controlling potentially if it's a private deployment. It has all the security benefits.
That just opening up that auction and opening up that spectrum has just opened up a world of opportunities. I was always amazed at some of these agencies where, the majority of the workforce is a mobile workforce, but the port on the applications, a lot of times the first port and the second port is still to the desktop. Frank, tell us about a program that you're working on that you can give us some specifics on in regards to enabling the workforce from a mobile perspective.
Well, let's talk about working with legacy applications, since we have lots of them.
Sure.
So then, we want to go mobile first, but since these applications have been around for a long time, that's not going to be easy. So one of the applications we're running right now is a mobile app that basically attaches itself to 3 legacy applications. Mm-hmm. And it's very messy when you do this because there are 3 different types of applications. And the gateways into those applications are more difficult. And so one of the apps is basically a logistics app. It's a pilot because we're trying to actually do this right and set up a framework where we will use the same framework for all the other applications, especially when they're accessing legacy. And so the issue is, how am I going to grab 3 legacy data from 3 different databases, from different systems, and actually write back to them with updates? So in logistics, you actually do this because you have to order parts, take parts, and so you have to put requests in and grab things back and forth. And so this is causing some issues because, of course, we have to go through all sorts of ATOs because it's three different groups are actually running the data, so it's 3 different data sources, so they all have to agree to it. They all have to agree to the 2-way interface and everything else. And so we're playing through that right now as to what it takes to actually do this. And that'll be the model that we're going to use for all the other legacy attachments that we have to do for mobility now. Because it seems to be the way we have to go. We have too many legacy applications sitting there that we cannot convert immediately. I mean, we want to go mobile first, but really it's really difficult because you have this infrastructure base of 2,000-3,000 applications sitting there that you have to maintain. And the question becomes, how quickly can you actually take those into a mobile environment? And we're finding that it takes a while, obviously, because you have to do the analysis and everything else in the connectivity.
And all that refactoring and figuring out how to pull all that data together, fuse it onto the desktop into a sort of a mobile device and do it securely, right? And that's not an easy thing to do.
And we're trying not to refactor the legacy as little as possible.
Right.
Because it takes forever to go through that program and change it.
Are you using any automated tools to do that, or is it just sort of
There's some automated interfaces that we're working with right now because of the different legacies that we have to interface with. You can't actually go into the database per se because they're all front-ended by legacy software. So you have to go through the software and you can pull the data in and out and look like you're a normal user to that legacy application. And so it's a challenge to do this, but again, it's the way that we have to go because of all the applications that we have right now.
Sure, you've got to maintain the current and the legacy, and then sort of move yourself into this modern mobile environment. Well, we'll talk about the rest of the specific programs when we come back, but we have to take a short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. With me on today's show are Frank Konieczny, Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Air Force; Dave Driegert, Assistant Program Manager, Mobility Sea Warrior Program, U.S. Navy; Marc Jaffan, Vice President, Strategy Lookout; Dave Wright, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Network Standards, Ruckus Networks; and Randy Clark, Client Partner, DoD, Verizon Enterprise Systems. We're talking about mobility, and we were talking about specific programs. Let me go over to you, Marc, and talk about a specific program, maybe in a specific agency, that you want to highlight in regards to rolling out a mobility capability and certainly doing it securely.
So we've We've been able to do this across civilian, defense, and intelligence agencies, and really the approach we've taken is to enable the seamless movement of agents, of field agents, inside and outside of government, secure government networks, back outside to Wi-Fi networks, to wireless networks. And really the goal there and the use case that we've been able to deploy is giving these moving mobile assets really the protection they need to continue to be productive, to continue to be effective in the mission that they have. Our view is that as we look at the post-perimeter world, so the world in which you are seamlessly transitioning in and out of networks, the establishment of identity, the establishment of the user is a critical element, but equally so, it's the establishment of the threat profile of the device, of the endpoint device, and that's really been the area that we've focused on and the contribution that we've brought to some of these use cases in the agencies.
Right, and I think that's where I read where you're using a little bit of AI on that to do some of that analysis and look at pattern recognition, these sort of things, and see where you have some anomalies there, right?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the big leverage points that we have is we have a massive data set in the cloud. We call it our Intelligent Security Cloud, and that really gives us the ability to take comparative looks at things that we see on devices against things that we've seen in the past, use machine learning against our data set, and really be able to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to provide the security on device.
There's anomalies there. Dave, how about at the Navy? Can you give us a specific program? I'm sure you have many there of where you're using mobile to enable your workforce there.
Yeah, definitely. A great one would be our Cleric mobile application, which is the Navy Center for Language, Regional Expertise, and Culture. For a lot of us who've worn the uniform, we know we work across the globe, and one of the challenges there is educating sailors on the theater that they're going to be operating in. And the Cleric mobile application that's in production and in sailors' hands today provides them a whole host of different country packages, which essentially provides a lot of information and sort of do's and don'ts of the area of operation that they're going into. A lot of times when a sailor, let's say, gets deployed over to Okinawa, Japan, there's a period of time where they need to learn about the culture, some of the language, and again, the do's and the don'ts of that area of operation. And this application will allow them to quickly download the Japan country package, learn about that country before they ever step foot in that area. And they can do so at this point right now, we're including almost 70 different country packages in there. So no matter where that sailor goes, they can quickly get spun up on that area of operation before they ever step foot in that
So
that
is
area.
that their own device, or is that a Navy-issued device?
They
Because I
can
heard you
download that
talk
right-
a little bit of BYOD there.
Sure,
Haven't heard
it can be
that
downloaded
term
right,
lately.
right from their own device, or if they have a government device, it could be used on that as well. But we understand that most sailors have at least one mobile device on them, whether that be a phone or a tablet, and we wanted to make sure that both through iOS devices and Android devices, they can download it and use it as they see fit. And ultimately, we work directly with our cybersecurity team, our legal team, our public affairs team to make sure that the content and functionality we put on that application is blessed off for public release. So we can put those applications right into the commercial app stores and make it easily available to the sailors. Because ultimately, we want to provide the same kind of capability, the same experience they have downloading any app that they would in their personal life. And so we don't want to have them jump through different hoops to have to download and use an application. We want to make it easy and seamless for them.
Fantastic. You know, the sailors getting, the ability to indoctrinate themselves into a local culture via their mobile device. I think that's great. All right, Randy, what's going on with 5G at Verizon?
Well, I'm not going to release the list. So nice try. I'll let others.
Wanted it to be a first here.
Right. I'll let others do that. What I'll say about 5G is there's fundamentally two different flavors, right? There's mobile 5G and fixed 5G. What you're going to see Verizon do initially is launch with fixed 5G. It is, from a commercial perspective, an ability to provide a great deal of bandwidth to a building without wires. That's beneficial to the federal government on base, post, and station because it's less intrusive to the prem, right? You're not trunching across flight line in order to deliver bandwidth. You look at logistics depots and you have to provide voice over IP telephony to every single building, but you got a trench. So those fiber costs are enormous.
Buildings,
right,
there's
historical
lots of,
buildings.
applicability here, yeah.
You know, you go to Okinawa. Okinawa is coral. Hawaii, K-Bay, coral.
Yep.
It's 5 times more expensive to trench in coral than it is dirt. So mobile 5G is going to enable the extension of a great deal of bandwidth into office buildings or condominiums or barracks very quickly, and it'll be very agile. So that's very attractive, right? And one of the interesting things about 5G, because of its bandwidth and its low latency, there's research being done on trilateration, which is the ability to create a geofence, and we assume that within a 1/16 of an inch, a device within a classified processing area or a SCIF, right, can have data on it while it's in the geofence within a 1/16 of an inch of tolerance. That information is wiped.
5G has a lot of promise.
A lot of
5G
promise.
And mobile 5G. That's interesting.
Absolutely.
We like to talk about lessons learned, and as you all as a community are really sort of blazing the path here, and we'd like to share that with our community. So, Dave, let me ask you at Ruckus, give us some lessons learned about what you're seeing across the community as you rolled out this type of capability and things people need to be thinking about.
Sure. So we're learning a lot of lessons through this real, sort of inaugural attempt for industry and the federal government, DoD specifically, to figure out how to share spectrum. For the first time, as Randy and I have highlighted, a lot of these next generation wireless services, they have pretty broad bandwidth requirements, and so there's it sometimes seems like a never-ending appetite for additional spectrum for commercial services, and when industry goes to the commission and asks for additional spectrum, it often ends up coming back to the federal side via NTIA, and we get congressional mandates or presidential mandates to free up spectrum. Assistant Secretary Rettle at NTIA and the DoD CIO's office have been very clear that clearing and repurposing spectrum, especially below 10 gigahertz, is getting very challenging. And so the preferred method going forward will be sharing frameworks like CBRS. Right. But that really requires federal and commercial to work very closely together, and to do that early, to get the information to the extent that we can from the federal incumbents about their operations, their security considerations, operational security considerations, get all of that on the table, and then really work together to create a framework that preserves the federal incumbent capabilities while opening up some of these lightly used bands for new commercial services.
Right. I mean, there's only so much spectrum there,
right?
Getting
any more of it. Yeah.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's a precious commodity.
And I was just going to say, Assistant Secretary Rettles talked about looking at 3450 to 3550 as another potential band where we could do some sharing. So we're looking to apply a lot of these lessons learned from CBRS into that process.
Fantastic. Frank, how about at the Air Force? I'm sure you've got a lot of lessons learned about things that you're encountering and have overcome in regards to your mobile strategy.
Yeah, the first is understand what the user actually needs. Because that always seems to be that the developers like to do things which are really cool.
Right.
And the users are like, I don't understand what you're actually building for me. So especially with the logistics one, what happened was the legacy systems were so complex that it was difficult to actually learn how to manage legacy systems. So obviously you didn't want to replicate those into a mobile device because it would be impossible. So the question was, how do you work with the actual user environment to see how they actually are doing this, especially in the environment where they're at? Because you can't assume that it's perfect conditions all the time. And that's one of the issues that we always have, is that they're on the flight line. This is not exactly sitting at their desk in an air-conditioned room. The other thing that we actually learned is that we try to standardize the development process as well as the infrastructure that you're going to have to use. Because when we first started out, we had multiple ways of doing this. In fact, too many ways of doing this in actuality.
Sure.
And so we're trying right now to standardize what is the standard way, the best way, the optimal way to efficiently provide the service to the airmen out there, as opposed to saying, well, just code it and they'll come. Because we find that every time they field an app like that, yes, people come, but it's not enterprise-wide and it can't be fielded that way either.
Can't scale it, right?
Can't scale it out.
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like centers of excellence is in order, right?
Yeah, we're trying to work with one right now to actually do this as a software factory.
Sure, exactly. Makes a lot of sense. Marc, how about at Lookout? I know you are involved in a lot of different agencies. I'm sure there's a lot of lessons learned out there and that you could share with our audience as they embark on this endeavor.
Yeah, the mobile security space continues to be an emerging one, and so we are finding ourselves in a fortunate situation where we can broaden the awareness, broaden the education about what mobile security is and what the need for mobile security is. Mobile security is really not solved with the traditional mobile device management solutions. That's a platform, it's a software platform that's effective in managing devices, but it really doesn't apply security. It leaves a gap when it comes to the security that a mobile device would then benefit from. And securing mobile devices is also very different than securing traditional laptops or desktops as well. It's a very different approach when you secure from an app-centric view versus the traditional legacy security approach. So we've certainly found that creating that awareness around MDMs not being sufficient for security, we found that securing in a way different than the traditional PC or laptop security approach, that these are all effective and necessary means and measures. The one gap we've identified or learned is that there's no uniform strategy across mobile at the federal level. NIST has had a mobile strategy for years, but there's no, not at a senior enough level, a government strategy that really defines mobile as a spectrum, or sorry, as a vector that really has both exposure and needs to be secured. There's a lot of discussion about IoT, and sometimes that jumps right over the mobile device, and we're not considering that mobile device in effect as an endpoint is perhaps even another form of IoT, right. But needs to be secured very differently.
Right, and it's all about multi-layer security, right? Just like you had in your sort of data center-centric environment, sort of guards, gates, locks, yes. Network perimeter, the data itself. You're locking down the device with an MDM project or a system of sorts, some sort of a product, and then you're actually locking down the data. Dave, how about at the Navy? Can you tell us, give us an example there of where you've been able to glean some lessons learned that you'd like to?
Yeah, certainly. I think I'll certainly echo Frank's first point is listen to your customers, right? Our young sailors, right? One of the things I try to do is go around and meet with the young sailors and understand their needs. Right, and understand what they're looking for from their Navy, right, to help them throughout their careers. And ultimately understanding those requirements will help drive us to the best solutions. But in saying that, also with our young sailors, right, because they're what I call digital natives, sure. We also have a large majority of our workforce that aren't digital natives, right? So we also have to make sure that we test and we look at our entire user group that's going to be using our mobile applications and services. So, but ultimately, it's really a focus on the customer in and of itself. The second, which I think we've kind of addressed, is a more tailored approach to mobile services and security and the strategy in which we approach mobility in the DoD. I completely concur. I think we kind of lack a centralized strategy, and ultimately, in the DoD, we've got our big DoD 5000, which ultimately dictates sort of how we do IT systems development, mobile applications and services. Very different, and it requires a much more tailored approach. And so one thing that we're certainly doing in the Navy is taking sort of the overall guidance in the DoD and tailoring it down to what's truly appropriate for mobile. Because one of the best aspects of mobile is the speed to capability. We can develop applications and services quickly and get those out to the fleet, whereas some bigger capabilities would take years to ultimately develop and deliver that capability. We want to try to harness that core capability of mobility and get that out to the sailors' hands quickly. Yeah. And it takes a tailored approach to do so.
And I think part of this challenge, especially in this space, is sort of this tectonic shift in this technology, right? And it's moving so rapidly. It's very difficult for NIST or anyone everyone else to sort of, get their hands on this framework and lock it down because this target moves so quickly. Randy, give us one example of a lessons learned, sort of what's a top, at Verizon, as you guys look across this entire universe, what's sort of the number one issue that you see out there that you'd like to share with the community as they're embarking on this movement?
Well, the movement is about network virtualization and cloud-based applications fundamentally, and I think when you think about that, interoperability, open APIs, are critical in order to create that uniformity across services, right, and across stakeholders. That's their commercial vendors, their contractors, the civilians they serve. Interoperability and open architecture is what fundamentally is going to future-proof the government's investment in IT. I think a lot of great work has been done over the last couple of years leveraging other transactional authorities, which is giving the government immediate access to innovation. And it's a rapid acquisition style used in the first Gulf War, and DIS is now using it. There's several consortiums, the C5, SOCI, the National Spectrum Consortium, DIUX is an OTA process.
CSV at large, very aggressive using OTAs.
Right, and I think that's important because it's enriching the acquisition community with ideas and small businesses that are driving emerging and disruptive technologies, and that's very good to see. Getting away from the traditional large programs of record that don't have spiral development in them and create technologies that are outdated by the time the operator gets their hands on them, right?
Sure.
So,
any lessons learned using the OTA that you'd want to point out that would, as different civilian agencies start to use this?
Well, I think they're attractive to both sides of the house, right? I pretty much outlined why it's beneficial to the federal government. From a contractor perspective, it's a way to get fresh and new ideas and new architectures into the mainstream, knowledge bank. But it also allows for operational evaluations and not science experiments. So we're being measured and tested against requirements known and unknown. And I think that's an attractive environment to operate in.
Sure, and as this technology moves very rapidly, it would seem like a vehicle like OTAs, for example, would be a good mechanism as you prototype these things. And I know in DoD you now have the authorization, done right and done properly, of course, to work that all the way through to a full implementation, and which I think is fantastic. Good marriage of the different type of acquisition mechanism against a technology that's moving very rapidly.
Yeah, and if I could just add, the government needs to draft behind commercial innovation. They need to get 6 months behind it, right? In mobility, there's over $60 billion of R&D spent by the big OEMs, and it takes years for the government to digest that. And
Sure.
They need to get in the draft. I'm not saying adopt 100% COTS.
Right.
There are going to be
Get behind
situations.
it closely.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, well, interesting topic, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that when we come back, but we need to take a short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. With me on today's show are Frank Konieczny, Chief Technology Officer, U.S. Air Force, Dave Driegert, Assistant Program Manager, Mobility Sea Warrior Program, U.S. Navy, Marc Jaffan, Vice President, Strategy Lookout, Dave Wright, Director, Regulatory Affairs and Network Standards, Ruckus Networks, and Randy Clark, Client Partner, DoD, Verizon Enterprise Solutions. All right, we're talking about mobility, and I wanted to open it up to challenges, and I'm sure there's a lot of those, so we're going to ask you, Dave, at the Navy. Tell us about some of the challenges that you're having out there and maybe some of the ways that you're trying to overcome those or things that you're anticipating.
Certainly, one of the big challenges is bringing the sailor the same experience for Navy information and functionality that they are accustomed to in their personal lives with mobility. Right, a simple example of this is going into their banking app, right? Being able to log in securely and being able to see some personalized, sensitive information. We're trying to bring that same capability to them within the Navy, bringing them their personal information about their training, their education, to be able to manage their career from a self-service mobile application. There's quite a few challenges to doing that. One is just the way we authenticate sailors in the Navy. That's through the Common Access Card, right? You got to put a physical card in a device. Well, that doesn't work well with mobile applications and devices. So one of the things that we're tackling right now is to do just standard multi-factor authentication and get away from the Common Access Card. And so we can allow a sailor to authenticate securely into a mobile application to get to their own personal information. And so that's a big challenge that we see right now, is providing them something that they're used to doing on a desktop in an office type environment. But we understand that most sailors don't work in an office. They work on a ship or in the field. And we want to be able to provide that same capability that they would have in an office right to their personal device.
Right, that user experience from a consumer perspective, and also from just my desktop at work. If I'm working on a case management system and I want to do that remotely, I want to have the same experience. Dave, how about at Ruckus Networks? What's the challenges out there that you see that you're looking to overcome?
Sure. So again, kind of certainly back to, pardon me, to one thing Randy brought up about federal government drafting off of what's going on in commercial development. I certainly agree with that point. I think another aspect of that is just pacing, right? It's and I think Dave also alluded to this with mobility applications within the Navy, trying to roll those more quickly. And as industry and the government work more closely together on spectrum-related issues, bringing new bands into service, sharing those bands, as Colonel Williams from the CIO's office of DoD said last month at a NTI Spectrum Symposium, we've just got to learn a lot more about each other. That is industry and the federal side. Industry's always wanting to get things to market quickly. The pace at DoD is not always quite the same. So we're at a point now where we're trying to get the CBRS band commercialized, and there's some DoD approvals that are going to be needed on that, obviously because of the incumbencies there. And so I think finding that right balance between—
Sounds like that might have been a request out there.
Could have been. But just finding that right balance and the right kind of collaborative pacing, I think.
Right, important to be able to manage that spectrum, right, like we talked about, and certainly the identification piece of that and making sure that's bulletproof but seamless, right? Frank, how about at the Air Force? Tell us about some of the challenges that you all are having there and sort of how you're overcoming that.
Well, I think, as Dave's mentioned, one of the challenges is security, especially when you get to the flight line and everything else, and how you do authorization and authentication for the people. I mean, we're looking at continuous authentication capabilities right now, so that you don't have to put in a CAC card, you don't have to put in a PIN. The device knows that it is you, based upon your gestures, based upon your actions, based upon everything else. So when you get to the flight line, you're out there, you don't have to do anything. The device knows that it is you and authenticates you back to the system, as well as giving you access control to those things. Because a lot of the problems we have is that the legacies and everything else gives you immediate access to almost everything. And so the idea is to look at your attributes and go back another layer besides authentication. I know who you are, but I have to make sure that you have the correct access, because again, we're doing lots of applications out there. And if you get to the point where you have critical applications, where logistics is a critical one, as well as personnel, as well as going to the point of using Fitbits to determine how physically fit you are, so you don't have to do your physicals. Right. You're getting to the point where, it does apply to exactly who you are all the time.
Right. And where you are, which we saw those articles in the news about that. Marc, how about at Lookout? Tell us about some of the challenges that you're seeing out there and some of the ways that you guys are overcoming it.
We're addressing those. As I mentioned earlier, I think a national standard or strategy around mobile security is certainly one of the big challenges that we see. There's no uniformity around that. There's no consistency in a national strategy across the government. So that's one of the big challenges that we've identified. Beyond that, I would say, and I'll pick up on what Dave was saying as well, to the extent that devices are now being used in the multi-factor authentication process, mobile devices are being used as a form of authentication, the risk profile, the threat profile, or the health of that device becomes extremely important to establish before that authentication is even allowed. Because if you are authenticating from a compromised device, you're effectively defeating the authentication process that's in place to ensure the identity of the user. So that's one of the other areas that we've focused on, trying to complement some of these transitions to more mobility, more mobile usage, and really enabling that to be done in a secure way. Simply banning a device, simply banning mobile usage is not going to work. As you said earlier, the users are actually expecting to use a mobile device, whether it's in the work setting or the personal setting, in a very, very consistent way. And the challenges that we've identified in some of the policies, where simply locking down a device to an extreme extent or banning a mobile device simply doesn't reflect where the place is going.
Prohibit the use of it in some cases where you're trying to do all the right things there, and I think that's where this multi-layer security, including things like derived credentials and those sort of things, and baking that in and making that a great experience is going to be super important. Well, we like to wrap it up here with sort of a vision of the future, and we're going to start with you, Randy, at Verizon. So paint a picture, what does it look like out there? What do you see over the next couple of years that the audience, the community can be expecting from Verizon?
Well, the value of mobility is the value of the time sensitivity of the data, right? So zero decision-making time is what's going to be enabled by the networks of the future. That's what 5G is bringing, not only to the human being, but to automated and semi-autonomous, robotic devices or telemetry, right? Or just collecting sensor data real time and being able to analyze it locally. So from a DoD base post and station perspective, I applaud the Air Force for their initiatives with the LTE infrastructure program. They have to leverage the willingness of commercial cellular to invest on federal lands. They have to provide fair and equal access. It's not an easy process, especially when you talk about 5G and the densification of networks, because now we're talking about small cells versus cell sites, right? So 20 cell sites versus 1 cell site. So there's issues there and challenges, but I think that the Air Force initiative is working through them. I think they're on the tip of the spear there. Hope to see sister services, use their process, right, to enable all of DoD. The network of the future is enablement of IP addresses globally over disparate networks, privately owned, publicly owned, regardless of transport, Bluetooth, cellular, satellite, right, light, microwave. So this homogeneous network architecture is what's going to enable the fourth, industrial revolution. And the security architecture, like I mentioned earlier, STP, is one of those technologies that'll enable that. STP is a reverse handshake to the network, right? It partitions the network. It splices the session. It provides an IP address access to an application dynamically. So it gives total control over that session, and there's no forensic evidence when the session is expired, and that can be minutes, days, weeks, or years.
So a fully mesh network. Marc, what does the future look like over the next couple of years? So we've got a fully mesh network. We have to secure it. What do you see from Lookout's perspective?
Yeah, we do. As we heard today, I mean, we're going to have the bandwidth to do more from the mobile devices as these mesh networks get built out. We're going to have more
5G, mobile, and hardwired.
It's all comes together. More applications being developed, more utilization on mobile devices, a shift from legacy applications to mobile applications. All of that is just going to drive us to be doing more work on the mobile devices, and in turn having more sensitive or important information on mobile devices. And if you look at some of the initiatives that are being discussed, DISA is talking about replacing identity access cards and replacing those with mobile devices. There's talk about creating or using mobile devices for driver's license, mobile driver's license. Think ahead, why not a passport on your mobile device? Why not vote on a mobile device. There are a number of different areas that we are going to be finding ourselves using mobile devices for in the future. And all of that valuable information and ensuring the health profile, the security of the device is going to be an absolute imperative.
And I think, obviously the technology is going to continue to move along at Mach speed, and as the trust of securing that device, some of these capabilities that you're describing, I think, will become more and more prevalent. Dave, how about at Ruckus Networks? What do you see as far as what the future is looking like over the next couple of years?
Right. So looking at the post base station, we see a future where there is pervasive wireless connectivity, and that's secure, high performance. We'll be providing the Wi-Fi solutions to enable that with the security overlay for that. Then we're now getting into the LTE business with the CBRS opportunity. We think that, as Randy pointed out, the network of the future is going to be very dense. It's going to go to small cells, both for, Wi-Fi is inherently a small cell technology and always has been, but cellular is moving in that direction as well, just to get the capacities and the latencies that are going to be needed going forward. So, that's what we see from a network kind of deployment and topology on the base. And then the other aspect we see in the future is, again, federal and commercial users sharing some bands more, especially in this kind of mid-band range, sub 10 gigahertz, where federal incumbents, DoD incumbents continue to operate uninterrupted, but commercial users sort of work around them.
Fantastic. Very important to, again, manage that spectrum and be able to wring that capability out. And I love the idea of this sort of sharing between both the agency and the private sector kind of partnership on some of that kind of stuff. That's a little bit what you saw in the FirstNet concept, right? Right. Dave, how about at the Navy? I know the Navy goes through, all the services go through an extensive, analysis of out 20 years and that kind of thing. But, bring us back a little bit. If I'm a sailor and I'm going to be enlisted, or an officer, what am I going to expect to see on a ship or what have you over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, which doesn't sound like that far away, and certainly from a technology standpoint, again, rapid adoption. So what does that look like to you guys?
I think, again, for us, it's really kind of, again, focusing on the sailor, their needs, their requirements, right, and bringing them the same mobile capabilities that they have in their day-to-day lives, right, being able to access their information, being able to take training, and being able to do things right from that personal device that they can expect from the moment that they enter the Navy to the moment they are operationalized to the time that they retire, right? Through their entire life cycle, we want to be able to provide them the capabilities through their mobile device that they would expect, again, in their personal lives, right? Being able to access, and let's say they're in an operational environment and they want to submit leave, right? Being able to do that right from their mobile device. It's those type of capabilities that ultimately reduce the distraction from the administrative burdens and allow them to do their job easily and more effectively. And I think ultimately the sailor can expect to gain those capabilities through their mobile devices and applications in the next few years.
How about on the classified side? Is there going to be a day where, I know there's some capabilities out there we used to use at Department of Homeland Security, it was a little clunky at the time. Do you see a day where that's going to smooth out and be able to maybe the collateral environment be able to have a mobile type of capability in that use case?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of great use cases within the classified and tactical environments that we're actually executing right now.
Oh, really?
And ultimately, when as industry has talked about, right, there's a lot of device hardening and network hardening and security advancements that we've made that allow us to take advantage of doing things more at the classified levels in the tactical environments. And I think ultimately, if you look at it from a sort of the tip of the spear, right, that's where ultimately the DoD really needs to support our war fighters, is providing that tactical and those classified capabilities to the sailor. So I think there's going to be a strong focus moving forward on those environments as well.
Yeah, you talked about the the time of being able to get data to the users, to the warfighter, so to speak, and classified information would certainly be a part of that. Frank, how about at the Air Force? What does that look like as far as over the next couple of years?
Over the next couple of years, we're going to probably extend the mesh network out from the aerial side to the land side. That's the intent in the long run anyways, is to be able to do the data across the board and get it quickly between the satellites as well as the ground stations and everything else. You're going to have a very fast structure in that place to actually support that. And that's going to be a secure structure as well, and it could go to the secret level. But I think you're going to see devices coming out that we haven't thought about yet, and how we're going to use those devices. I mean, we talk to our phones right now. Well, why can't you just talk to the phone for every application you have and get information back to right away from the real legacy systems? Which we have a pilot for augmented reality right now. So in the field, you're going to see those extended more and more out there as to what do you think you can actually do. And we talked about using Fitbits for recording your activity to determine if you should take a physical or not. So it's a question of how we're going to use the devices that we currently have into a new frame of reference as to where we want to go with them. I mean, we have the devices, and we have a lot of airmen who are intelligent enough to think of all sorts of cool ways of using them. It's a question of how we're going to go forward with them right now. And I think you're going to see an explosion of that as soon as we get the connectivity there. Everybody's going to say, hey, I could use my device for this, and why can't I do it now?
Right, and as that 5G capability gets out there, I can't imagine that there won't be just hundreds of use cases. And I know that even using biometrics to access it, whether it's a facial or a thumbprint kind of thing, is going to be another sort of seamless use of this capability. Well, we could certainly talk all day about this subject. I'd like to thank today's guests for taking the time from their busy schedules to join us for this program. I'd like to thank our sponsors, for without we don't have a show. And I'd like to thank the good people here at Federal News Radio that make our program so successful and enjoyable. And most of all, I'd like to thank the listening audience out there that tune in every month. You've been listening to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.